All right, let's get right into this explainer. Today, we're breaking down a really controversial sermon that's been making the rounds online, and it's built on a pretty explosive claim about the identity of the people in the modern state of Israel, all based on a very specific reading of Scripture.
So the whole thing, the entire foundation of this argument, hinges on this one single verse from the book of Revelation. The speaker takes this phrase, the synagogue of Satan, and identifies them as a major player, not just in ancient history, but in what's happening in the world right now.
So the big question is, how in the world does a speaker take this ancient text and apply it to modern-day geopolitics? What's the logic? What's the chain of evidence they use to build that bridge? Well, that is exactly what we are going to unpack step by step.
Okay, so the first step in this argument is really interesting. It doesn't start with ancient history. Nope. Instead, it frames the whole thing with a very modern and very powerful analogy.
The speaker basically accuses a group of committing what he calls a kind of spiritual stolen valor. The idea is that they're falsely claiming the identity of biblical Jews, not for military honors, but to gain legitimacy and, as he puts it, to shield themselves from any criticism.
And here it is, the core claim, spelled out. This is the heart of the whole sermon. The speaker isn't talking about some abstract idea. He's identifying that group from Revelation as the direct descendants of the biblical Edomites, and he claims they are the ones in power in Jerusalem today.
So, to back this up, the sermon doesn't stay in the New Testament. It goes way, way back, all the way to the book of Genesis, and this foundational story of two rival twin brothers, Jacob and Esau.
And as you can see here, the argument is that this wasn't just some sibling rivalry. It set up a deep ancestral conflict. You've got Jacob on one side, who gets renamed Israel and receives the birthright, and on the other, you've got Esau, who becomes Edom. He sells his birthright and, crucially, mixes his bloodline with the Canaanites, which, according to the sermon, puts his descendants on a totally separate and opposing path.
All right, so here's where the sermon makes its next big jump. It hones in on a specific and pretty complex period of history to argue that these two rival bloodlines didn't just stay enemies from afar, they actually became entangled. The speaker walks through this timeline, and it's presented as the absolute key turning point. You see, the Hasmonean rulers of Judea, they conquer the Edomites, also called Idumeans, and force them to convert to Judaism. But then, just a century later, boom, an Edomite, Herod the Great, is put on the throne by Rome as the king of the Jews.
And to back this up, the sermon points to ancient historians like Josephus. The argument is, look, this isn't a new idea. Even back then, the last real Hasmonean king, Antigonus, was reportedly calling Herod out, saying he was an Idumean, an Edomite, and basically an imposter who had no right to rule.
So the sermon lays out this idea of a historical takeover. But how does that connect to today? Well, the next step is to argue that this event totally reshaped the religious and political landscape of the New Testament and eventually our modern world. So the argument goes deeper. It wasn't just about who was king, it was a spiritual infiltration. The claim is that the top religious leaders of Jesus' day, the Pharisees, actually teamed up with the Herodians, the Edomite king's crew, to form this powerful united front against him. From there, the argument jumps forward in time, pointing to texts written long after the Bible, like the Babylonian Talmud. The speaker claims that this text, which is absolutely central to modern rabbinic Judaism, contains statements that are hostile to Christianity and presents this as evidence of an ongoing spiritual war.
And this is a really critical piece of the puzzle for the sermon's argument. It makes this direct and, highly contested leap to the modern world. The claim is that the name of the super influential Rothschild family is basically a code, translating to Shield of Edom, implying this hidden lineage is still secretly in power.
Okay, so we've got the history, we've got the linguistic claim. Now the sermon brings it all together and ties it into a very specific interpretation of end times prophecy. The idea is that this ancient fight is far from over. In fact, it's heading for a final climactic chapter.
To explain the why, the motive, the speaker pulls from the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel. The argument is that these prophecies lay out Edom's deep-seated, long-term goal to take back the birthright by force, seizing the land of Israel and Judah, which they believe is rightfully theirs.
And here's the proof text, the specific verse used to anchor this entire claim. It's framed as God himself condemning Edom for taking his land with joy and contempt, which, according to the sermon, is a perfect description of what's happening today. It's presented as prophecy being fulfilled right before our eyes.
And that's how it all wraps up. The whole narrative leads to this one conclusion.
The major conflicts we see today, they aren't new. According to this sermon, they're just the final explosive chapter in that thousands of years old rivalry between the house of Jacob and the house of Esau, with Esau's descendants currently occupying the land, waiting for that final showdown.
So that leaves us with the really provocative question at the very heart of this sermon. If you follow this line of argument, that the people currently in Jerusalem are not who they claim to be, what does that imply for the future of one of the most contested places on earth? Understanding that logic is really the key to seeing why this sermon has become so compelling for some people.